Great. Thanks so much, Tony. And a pleasure working with you as well while I was at UVM on this and other work. So thank you, Tony. And also, first and foremost, thanks to the Northeast CASC for both this webinar series, as well as for supporting much of the work that I'll talk about today. So what we'll be talking about is the balance between carbon and critters. So and how some of those inherent trade-offs exist in some contexts, in some forest and woodland contexts, and how we're starting to grapple with some of those trade-offs between the imperative that we really maximize carbon and keep it out of the atmosphere, while also addressing some of the wildlife crises that we're encountering. And so what we'll suggest is how the lens of climate change adaptation, how using that framework could really help us to navigate some of those trade-offs. So I'll first start off by giving a fairly broad overview of some of the principles associated with these trade-offs and with climate change adaptation, plus a glimpse into a couple different contexts, 4 different forest and woodland contexts across the Northeast and the Great Lakes region, in which these trade-offs are really quite apparent. And then I'll pass the mic over to John, who will give us a bit of a deeper dive into pitch Pine Barrens systems. So let's start with the big picture here. If I can advance these slides, come on. There we go. So this is a slide that nobody needs to see in this audience, I imagine. Of course, the planet is warming at an unprecedented rate, thanks to our use of fossil fuels and the conversion of natural land cover, namely forests, across the globe. So in that top time series, you're seeing anomalies relative to the 20th century average over 30-year climate normals. And then I include the bottom map as well, which shows winter departures in recent years from the average as well. What you can see is the Northeast, Great Lakes region, and of course the Northern Plains too, we're really seeing some of the most significant departures in winter temperatures across the country over the past century, which certainly has implications for wildlife as well as forest management. Plus, we're of course seeing highly variable precipitation now. So periods of drought, periods of intense precipitation, and that also has major implications for forest health, as well as the prescribed fire necessary to restore the pitch pine barrens that John's going to discuss in a little bit. So in addition, of course, to this kind of climatic change occurring everywhere, we're seeing species disappear at alarming rates across the globe. And that's due primarily to habitat loss and fragmentation. But around here in particular in the Northeast, we're also seeing the loss of unique habitat conditions that had historically been maintained by disturbance. So in this recent study shown here, we've lost an estimated 3 billion birds across North America over the past 50 years. And again, that decline is true across many taxa and largely due to habitat loss. But the erosion of critical habitat is also due in part to this dampening of disturbance that would have historically maintained a heterogeneity of conditions across the forested landscape. Plus, this habitat loss is compounded by the stresses of climate change, like increasing drought, weather extremes, and other stressors that are amplified by climate change, like the expansion of pests and pathogens. So we have these two dual interacting challenges of climate change and biodiversity loss. And those, of course, compel us to act fast, to swiftly curtail our greenhouse gas emissions and keep as much carbon out of the atmosphere as possible, to restore and prevent the continued loss of forest and woodland habitat, and of course, really all habitats, and also to think about stewarding our forests in a way that enable the forests themselves and the species therein to adapt to and respond to ongoing and upcoming threats. And I'll just pause here for a second to clarify or make the distinction here between climate change mitigation, which is trying to stop the problem, so that's keeping the carbon out of the atmosphere, and climate change adaptation, which is acknowledging and recognizing the changes that are coming down the pike and trying to adapt our systems and build their resilience, both in human and natural communities, to ensure that they can cope in the face of these changes. So on the climate change mitigation front, in terms of carbon, forests and woodlands themselves, of course, play a key critical natural climate solution. They have a tremendous capacity to store and sequester carbon. And what this graph here shows on the right, it's from a paper a couple years old at this point, but if we take advantage of natural climate solutions across all ecosystems, reforestation, avoided forest conversion, restoration of natural land cover, et cetera, that could get us a substantial portion of the way towards our goal of keeping the goal from warming by less than 2 degrees. Of course, this has to be accompanied by reducing fossil fuel use, but the fact remains that forests and natural land cover are a key part of the solution. Plus, independent of the carbon benefits of forests and natural land cover, of course, forests afford numerous other ecosystem services and benefits: clean air, clean water, wood products, recreation opportunities, cultural resources, etc. But carbon, of course, is a hot topic right now. And certainly the public, policymakers, and managers have taken note of the importance of forest carbon, perhaps especially the public. And I think it's fair to say that in parts of New England, maybe especially Massachusetts, parts are kind of ground zero for public opposition to active forest management because of the potential for trees and forests to sequester carbon. And that's great. It's like society's finally waking up to recognize that photosynthesis is hugely important. But what's not great is that I think in many cases, we have not done a great job as natural resource managers in the forestry realm and in wildlife management as well, of conveying some of the nuance associated with getting to the point of restoring habitat for the very wildlife we care about. So I'm not putting these photos up here of Wendell State Park in Massachusetts, where a funeral was held for trees that were removed, or in the lower right-hand corner, this is the park up here in Burlington, Vermont, where unhealthy trees were also being removed. I'm not at all trying to disparage against these kind of protests against active forest management. And in fact, many folks who might be attending these protests are allies in conserving forests and forest land. But we just need to improve our understanding of what it takes to manage forests in a way that restores and maintains the very habitat that protects the biodiversity we care about, especially in the face of climate change. So, okay, off that commentary about public recognition, we're also seeing huge amounts of carbon credits being transacted on the compliance and voluntary forest carbon markets. We're seeing initiatives to plant millions, billions, even trillions of trees across the planet, in national scales, regional scales, state levels, et cetera. And just in general, a growing interest in keeping as much carbon on the ground out of the atmosphere as possible in trees. For example, what we might do to do so is allowing some forests to mature and even actively promoting old growth characteristics. So retaining ample standing and down dead wood, actively promoting some characteristics that are typical of older forests in, for example, here in the northern hardwood mixed wood stand. So above ground live, dead, and soil carbon pools might all grow under these conditions. And many wildlife species stand to benefit from them: fisher, martin, pileated woodpecker, eastern redback salamanders, etc. And I'll take a moment here to put in a plug for a great new publication that just came out by Tony and Paul at UMass. This is a guidebook for thinking about how one might restore old growth conditions to both support the wildlife that rely on these other conditions, as well as take advantage of the fact that these kind of conditions can store a huge amount of carbon. But what happens, though? That's the question I'm going to ask now. What happens when strategies to maximize carbon on the ground in forests and woodlands don't quite align with some of the disturbance-oriented strategies that are necessary to maintain or promote certain habitat types for threatened or declining wildlife? And as I've heard from many wildlife and natural resource managers, they're acutely aware of this question as pressures mount to avoid any management that seemingly compromises carbon storage, particularly in above ground tree biomass. And so here what we'll suggest is that the lens of climate change adaptation can help us to navigate this challenge and these trade-offs. And I'll illustrate that proposition in 4 examples in a moment. But this adaptation lens calls upon us to anticipate and figure out what changes are coming down the pike, and whether we're certain about them or not. And therefore, we've kind of got to zoom out to the landscape level and think about how we might prioritize diversity and ecological complexity to ensure resilience and that species and systems are able to respond. So it thereby also calls upon us, as we pursue that kind of diversity and complexity, to maintain and restore natural disturbance regimes and to explicitly account for some of the trade-offs that can enable us to accommodate multiple objectives and identify where win-wins might exist. And inherently, climate change adaptation as a framework for management is inherently adaptive and dynamic in that way. And this proposition is something that Tony and I laid out in a paper earlier this year, and perhaps Will or others might be able to include the link to this as well as the old growth guide, perhaps in some webinar notes. Okay, so that's kind of the proposition and the framework that we're talking about, that climate change adaptation approach. But where does the rubber meet the road? And so I'll dig into some of these 4 case studies now, and I really had the pleasure of collecting stories from natural resource and wildlife managers across the region, across the Northeast and Great Lakes, and state and federal fish and wildlife agencies. These are case studies and stories in which these folks are increasingly facing the challenge of managing for certain wildlife species and promoting habitat for those species, when doing so inherently means not maximizing above ground carbon storage. So here I'll walk through 4 contexts in the Northeast and Great Lakes in which that trade-off is unfolding, and suggest how the lens of climate change adaptation can help us to navigate those trade-offs. And I think what you'll see is that a common theme through each of these 4 systems is that disturbance, often fire, whether naturally occurring or from indigenous burning, that's what had maintained these habitats historically. And it's often the lever by which we can maintain and restore these habitats moving forward if we restore that kind of disturbance. So first, let's talk about early successional habitat in New England's northern hardwoods. So here in Vermont, where I'm sitting, about 80% of the landscape was denuded of forests during European settlement. Perhaps some of you have seen some of these dioramas at Harvard Forest, which really demonstrates that dramatic change in the landscape and forest cover over time. So now, of course, much of the landscape is forested again, but in the middle-aged class largely. So we certainly don't have a lot of old forests. We also certainly don't have a lot of young forests. And in fact, there's less early successional young forest habitat in the landscape now than there was before European arrival. So much of that had been maintained, those young forest conditions and early successional states had been maintained by disturbance agents such as beavers and the succession of beaver meadows. And we largely reduced beaver populations tremendously over the past few centuries. Other processes and agents also help to maintain or reset systems to earlier conditions. So for example, the ice scouring that would have traditionally happened along our rivers were largely dampened by flood control dams, my backyard on the left notwithstanding. We also wiped out passenger pigeons, and they themselves and their consumption of vegetation and guano affected woody plant growth as well. And certainly indigenous populations who may well have maintained agricultural patches as well as burning, those are largely gone too. So along with that decline in early successional habitat across the landscape, we're also seeing a decline in species, wildlife species, especially breeding birds that require that young kind of forest habitat. So for example, the chestnut-sided warbler has been declining in recent decades as we've lost overgrown fields and second-growing forests have matured. They nest a few feet off the ground in low bushes or saplings in patches that are at least half an acre. Same goes to the New England cottontail, obligate users of young stands that have higher rates of survival in patches that are even bigger, so 3 acres or more, in which they're not going to encounter winter food shortages or predation. So because many of these early successional specialists take off after 5-10 years, we need to be actively promoting a patchwork of these conditions across the landscape. And again, we have ample middle-aged forests, if you will, to restore to these conditions and to old forest conditions as well. Active forest management is likely the best lever we have to do so, as in this patch cut with reserves. Of course, in doing so and conducting this kind of harvest, we're inherently reducing the live above ground carbon stored on site. But if we create this mosaic across the landscape, that helps to maintain the critical habitat needed for a lot of these species that are declining. And also from a climate change adaptation lens, that sort of mosaic can afford refugia or stepping stones for wildlife species as their ranges shift northward. And it also increases the diversity of tree species, of age classes, of structural diversity in our forests. And that inherently affords more resilience in terms of community reshuffling under a warming climate, as well as the other stressors that might be coming down the pike, invasives, insects, diseases, et cetera. So again, diversity being that theme here, diversity at a landscape scale of habitat conditions and diversity within forest stands as well. Once again, though, this habitat maintenance, of course, reduces that live above ground carbon at any given site, but that stand level trade-off I think is more than compensated for from a broader wildlife perspective and climate adaptation perspective of the landscape scale. But before we shift west to a couple other examples in the Midwest, I want to pause and step back to just comment on how dramatically fire maintained vegetation has changed throughout the eastern US. So on the left-hand side there, you see two maps describing the difference, how we've really shifted from a much more many more fire maintained systems into much more music systems across the eastern seaboard. So this largely was due not only to the loss of forests in general, development, agriculture, preferential removal of and management for certain tree species, but also this pervasive shift from fire adapted species to more fire sensitive and dense forests. So the mesification, if you will. That's a self-reinforcing process that as fire exclusion and denser conditions shift the microclimate towards cooler, wetter, more shaded conditions, you also see a loss of fire adapted species towards more fire sensitive species. And then beyond that, not just the mesification, but also densification of forests, and certainly those two interact. And in the Midwestern open forests and savannas in particular, we've really seen a continued densification as fire has been excluded. So historical conditions on the left of that chart there, we had far fewer trees per acre, and now we're seeing far more closed forests in our current conditions. So keep those two different trends in mind as we head west to Minnesota and Michigan in these next two case studies. So in northern Minnesota and elsewhere, along the margin of the prairies and boreal forests, we see this quilt of prairie and woodlands. And this landscape really reflects an enduring legacy of glaciation and massive glacial lakes that receded about 10,000 years ago. Much of this landscape was lake bottomed, and due to the fact that it was peaty and wet, there really weren't a whole lot of forested areas. But as those areas have been filled in and ditched for agriculture, and as fire has largely been excluded from the landscape, we've seen more tree encroachment, especially an expansion of aspen. Historically, prior to the ditching and draining and expansion of trees, elk were common throughout this biome and caribou further to the east. Both species were extirpated from Minnesota in this region, and only in the past few decades have those numbers begun to rebound, largely because of some of the restoration work that's been going on. When restored, this is ideal habitat, a mosaic of woodland cover and large open areas for foraging. Those woodlands provide escape from humans and also can function as movement corridors. And then certainly there are other species that fish and wildlife managers in these regions support. Sandhill cranes that nest in wet shrubby habitat, sharp-tailed grouse that use stagnant bogs or burn patches within a treed matrix. So for each of these wildlife species, maintaining tree islands, but also ample brushy habitat and open areas, that's key. It also means keeping much of this condition and much of this landscape in the form of arrested development, if you will. So through shearing and mowing, through larger patch cuts and clear cuts, when there's decent access to markets, that's through prescribed burning, and even through promoting below ground burns and the smoldering that can kill tree root balls. That's the kind of maintenance and reduction in the tree encroachment that's necessary to maintain this kind of habitat for those wildlife species. And as we see more ungulates, like the elk, restored to the landscape, their grazing activities will also help keep in check that kind of tree encroachment. But again, as in the early successional forests, keeping a check on tree encroachment inherently means foregoing the chance to maximize carbon in live above ground trees. But the uniqueness of this biome and these habitat conditions and the wildlife we're managing for are worth that carbon trade-off. And of course, we know that diverse native grasses can sequester a huge amount of carbon, especially below ground. So in maintaining and promoting this quilt of tall grass prairie, the bogs, tree islands, woodlands, we're likely not sacrificing quite as much carbon as might at first seem apparent. So again, it's maintaining this patchiness and variability at a landscape scale that by facilitating or reintroducing disturbance is going to help us to maintain and support wildlife, and also inherently increases this landscape's ability to respond to ongoing climate impacts, far more so than, say, a homogeneous sea of aspen would. So heading a little bit further south into the east to southern Michigan and also other parts of the Great Lakes states, we see these oak savannas. And this is really where a context in which we see how apparent that trend of mesification and densification has been in oak savanna natural communities, or what small scraps are left. Because these systems, which historically would have been maintained by frequent low severity fires, working sort of in concert with drought and wind storms as well. These are some of the most threatened ecosystems in North America. Typically, oak cover would have spanned from 10 to 50%. That's oaks, hickories, other locally abundant species with varied shrub understories. And I remember one manager describing to me the bur oak grubs below ground that were decent sized trees, decades old, with above ground portions totally killed off by fire, but just waiting to sprout in the absence of that fire. So these are historically have been very fire maintained, fire adapted systems. And it's along some of those deep tap roots of the oaks that little guys like this eastern box turtle would hunker down during hibernation. But again, as we've excluded fire, we've seen more music species come in like red maple. These turtles have been in decline. The kind of fires that would have historically been here would also promote wild blue lupine, which the larva of the federally endangered Karner blue butterfly feeds. So they lay eggs in areas that have recently burned and thereby capitalize on the flush of nutrients in the lupine and other wildflowers that quickly sprout. So again, here's an instance in which thinning and reintroducing fire may be critical to maintaining that internal vegetative patchiness and high level of grass and forb diversity. Plus, it deters the encroachment of shrubs and saplings. Of course, once again, fire directly consumes biomass and therefore represents a pulse of carbon. But this is yet again an instance in which maximizing live above ground carbon is incompatible with maintaining this critical habitat. So reintroducing disturbance, it creates that variability at multiple scales that confers the kind of resilience of this landscape in the face of climate change and in the face of other threats. So for example, I've seen some evidence about the benefits to small mammal populations of the kind of mechanical thinning in these systems, the small mammals that then feed on invasive insects like the spongy moth. So once again, low live above ground carbon at the stand scale, but greater benefits extending beyond that stand scale. So finally, and I'll wrap up with this one, back to the Northeast and its pitch pine scrub oak barrens, which John will dig into in a little bit more depth. This is a globally imperiled ecosystem characterized by pitch pine with understories of blueberries, thickets of scrub oak that thrive in sandy soils. Decades of almost complete fire suppression have transformed these landscapes and enabled white pine in particular to displace pitch pine, not to mention the planting of red pine plantations as well. There are a number of rare and dwindling species here, especially invertebrates that rely on these barrens. Barrens buck moth, the tiger beetle, the frosted elfin butterfly, and it's thought that recent declines in the whippoorwill, which eat these invertebrates, have been attributable to a general reduction in these invertebrates. So restoration of these systems, as John will get into in much more depth, involves removing unhealthy red pine plantations, reducing the dominance of white pines, and restoring fire. So, of course, once again, this represents prescribed firing represents an immediate pulse of carbon into the atmosphere, and pursuing lower stocking in general, less dense forests, that also represents lower live above ground carbon storage. But first, we're restoring carbon, or restoring habitat for these imperiled species, plus reducing density in these overstocked stands can help reduce things like drought stress, which in turn helps increase tree resilience to other threats, like the southern pine beetle. And then also in reducing fuel loads, we're reducing the risk of more catastrophic wildfire. And John will give an example of one that unfolded in Massachusetts within the past century as well. So if some of these low value removals as well can go towards, for example, biomass energy that displaces fossil fuel use, all the better if we're conducting these removals. So those are 4 examples there. And John, again, is going to dig more deeply into the pitch pine example. But I do think that what's become apparent in looking through each of these is that maintaining and restoring disturbance can really help us to recapture that kind of landscape scale heterogeneity of habitat that's important for these species, while also helping us adapt to climate change. So again, climate change adaptation in these contexts is prioritizing landscape diversity and ecological complexity. We're doing so by restoring and maintaining natural disturbance regimes and explicitly thinking about what those trade-offs are between, for example, in these cases, carbon and wildlife habitat. And that can enable us to accommodate multiple objectives and pursue win-win approaches, and I think avoid no regrets approaches, or at least sometimes regrettable decisions. And with that, I think it's worth touching on one final piece that relates to our transition to a low carbon economy. So shifting away from fossil fuels is, of course, paramount to avoiding the worst impacts of climate change. But I do think it's important that we recognize and that we're accounting for the potential unintended consequences about where we site our renewable energy. So certainly there's ample research about the impacts of ridgeline wind on wildlife, especially bats and birds. And we've also lost thousands of acres across New England to solar farm development. Again, let's pursue these energies, absolutely, but let's think carefully about where we're putting them. How can we ensure that incentives that exist out there or policies and programs are helping make sure that solar farms are going on top of parking lots, for example, and not chewing away at the forest cover that we're starting to lose. So we need to account for these trade-offs, both in the habitat context as well as in where we're siting our renewable energy. And let's also be proactive in shaping programs and policies related to forest carbon. So for example, existing and future forest carbon programs, whether they're compliance or voluntary, they ought to better accommodate and even reward explicit efforts to support wildlife and habitat, even when it might mean there's not absolutely maximizing the carbon on the ground. Because right now, in many cases, increasing stocking is what carbon credits hinge on, and that can effectively penalize the maintenance of the sorts of habitats that we just discussed. Also, let's recognize that wood and biomass removed from habitat restoration can and should be directed towards long-term carbon storage. So for example, in mass timber or other harvested wood products, and in some cases, go towards biomass energy to displace fossil fuel use. And finally, this is no news, but we also have to continuously work to increase public comprehension of how ecological forest management and some of those nuances therein, and often restoring disturbance to the landscape, can support wildlife, carbon, and increase the resilience of our natural and human communities to face the changes that are coming down the pike. I think above all, I'll just end with this quote here, that we really shouldn't get tied down by a single objective like carbon, because forests afford innumerable benefits. So let's keep that in mind, that in the context of forest management, simplification is rarely beneficial. And so with that, I will turn it over to John.
Thank you very much, Caitlin, and hello, everyone. I'm pretty excited to be able to help out with this effort. And the one thing I want to stress from the start is that I am not an ecologist. Okay, I am a habitat manager by trade, so that's the perspective you're going to be getting from me here this morning. But I can tell you that through the nearly 40 years I've been working in natural resource conservation, honestly, pitch pine scrub oak barrens restoration turned out to be the most, I think, beneficial conservation action that I was ever involved with. And hopefully we'll see why that is as we move along. Well, I often felt like this during my career as a wildlife manager, habitat manager. I was always after wildlife habitat, but increasingly things in the last decade or two have increasingly become about carbon management to mitigate climate change. And I'm all for that. And a main point that I want to make today is that it doesn't have to be one or the other. All right, it's not an either or situation. We can do both, and we're going to look at how today. So not only is it a tug of war, but the tug of war we're involved here really has global implications. All right, I was always coming at things from the conserve biodiversity side, and increasingly the main call is mitigate climate change, which I totally get. And again, I am adamant that we can definitely do both. And we just need to talk about how to go about that. All right, so why are we talking about pitch pine scrub oak barrens? Well, I think there's a good reason to use this for a case study of trade-offs. I want to start with some private conservation groups. New York Pine Barrens are both, by their own assessment, critically imperiled within the state and also globally imperiled. Now, this is something that we're going to come back to a couple times during today's presentation, just how unique these systems are. And that's a nice photo from their site about what a restored, intact pitch pine scrub oak barrens looks like. We moved to New Jersey, which has one of the largest areas of pine barrens, believe it or not, available in the world. And we see a broad coalition of private and public sector groups who are working together, to try to secure, fully restore, and maintain this globally unique fire-adapted community on the landscape. All right, let's shift to Massachusetts, where we have a private conservation group, the Southeast Massachusetts Pine Barrens Alliance, who are in this work by their own words, because it's a globally rare ecosystem. Right? It's here in Massachusetts. This is one of 3 places left in the world where you can see these systems. New Jersey and New York being the other ones, and it's just hard to fathom that something that some of us might take for granted could actually be a globally imperiled system, but that really is the situation. Now, Southeast Pine Barrens Alliance has been around for a while, but knew that they couldn't do this work on their own, so they have formed what they're calling the Massachusetts Coastal Pine Barrens Partnership, which is a region-wide effort of both municipal and non-government entities that have gotten together to try to restore and conserve this rare ecosystem type. And one of the most recent additions to their group has been incorporation of indigenous knowledge, which is pretty important in southeastern Massachusetts. The Wampanoag tribe has come on board with this group and has been a big advocate for restoration and conservation of coastal pine barrens. Now, this group I like because they really make the point that pine barrens are anything but barren. They are a relatively infertile, but nevertheless biologically rich type of an environment. I believe the name comes from just the initial encounters of Europeans with these systems that didn't appear fertile to them because they're open canopied forests, and when they were tried to convert them to agriculture, they found because they were so excessively well drained, they weren't all that productive for agriculture. So anyway, it's a widely recognized viable conservation issue across both public and private conservation groups throughout the Northeast. And I wanted to share this map with you, which is hot off the press from 1935. And okay, so it's a little older, but old information can still be good information. In the cross-hatching, you can see the approximate original extent of what were called pitch pine plains by an author named Bromley back in 1935. You can see they were fairly extensive, mostly in southeastern Massachusetts, okay, out onto the Cape Cod. But please note that there are inland occurrences, especially associated with the Connecticut River Valley in central western Massachusetts. Montague Plains is one of the big pitch pine restoration success stories in Massachusetts. Work began there a couple of decades ago, was very controversial at the time because it involved some heavy cutting and prescribed burning, but is now very widely accepted and greatly appreciated there. The Muddy Brook area of Hardwick, Massachusetts, work began there about 6, 8 years ago. Again, very controversial at the time because it involved heavy cutting of white pine that had moved in due to fire exclusion, but again has shown tremendous results. Another site nearby, the Herman Covey Wildlife Management Area in Belchertown, Massachusetts, just south of the large Quabbin Reservoir, another site that has really shown great initial results after a couple of years. And one that is still in the planning stage and going to be getting underway soon is in this, what's referred to as the Squanicook area, the towns of Shirley and Townsend, Massachusetts. But again, this is proving very controversial with a lot of people opposed to tree clearing because it's plantations of exotic Norway spruce that were established, in the 1930s by the Civilian Conservation Corps, and they're seen as large carbon sinks. And so why would we be disturbing those? And that's some of the trade-offs we need to talk about today. Many Corellis out on Martha's Vineyard, a pristine, great example of a Pine Barrens system. And I want to hone in on the Miles Standish complex in southeastern Massachusetts, which is one of the largest remaining expanses of Pine Barrens habitat that is available for restoration. Right here we are zooming in on the Miles Standish area. It's quite extensive. This project is a cooperative effort between the Massachusetts Division of Fisheries and Wildlife, or Mass Wildlife, and the Mass Department of Conservation and Recreation, State Forests and Parks, and covers 2,400 acres. That hasn't all been completed yet, but it's well underway. And really, this is one of the few places on the planet where you can explore a relatively intact system. And one thing I really want to stress is, besides the biodiversity benefits, this kind of work has substantial wildfire risk reduction impacts, safeguarding human health and property. It also greatly enhances recreational opportunities. And I think you can see why in this next sequence of slides. We're going to look at 4 shots here of this work in progress. This one on the right shows the starting conditions, if you will. Imagine yourself trying to take a leisurely hike through that. And on the left is after an initial phase of mechanical mulching with large industrial scale mulching mowers, brontosaurus type machinery, they're often referred to. And so at this point, no material has been removed from the site. It's still all there, just mulched on site, and will decay fairly rapidly and be able to burn within 2 or 3 years. This photo shows a larger expanse after that initial mechanical mulching. The trees that you see here were picked out before the work began, spaced out so that a crown fire would not have a running crown fire would not be able to occur from tree to tree. Now, on this bottom left picture, you see some larger woody material. Fire has been excluded from these systems for long enough, getting towards 100 years now, where white pine, which grows very well on these sites in the absence of fire, really moved in and dominated. And here you see saw log material that has been cut and will all be removed. We do have the technology, the machinery to mulch this material in place, but then you have too much mulch on the ground, and it will not. You're not going to get the response that you want of the scrub oak and vaccinium species. So this is that same area 2 growing seasons later. This is before the first prescribed fire, but it's ready to burn. And the point I want to stress here is that the root systems of the scrub oak and high bush and low bush blueberry and other native shrubs, they have been suppressed for a century, haven't seen fire in a century, but they're still there, just waiting to be exposed to sunlight. And this is the kind of response that you see with just the mechanical treatment. Okay, let's talk a little bit about forest carbon storage in general, and then narrow right down to these pitch pine oak systems. All right, this data is from the U.S. Forest Service Forest Inventory and Analysis (FIA) section, and not surprisingly to any of us, the majority, the biggest carbon pool in a forest is the live above ground biomass, the trees. No great surprise, but what may surprise you, and what I really want to stress for the purposes of this presentation on trade-offs, is that the soil carbon pool is substantial. All right, fully a third across all forest types in Massachusetts, and it's second only to the live above ground carbon storage in live trees. And we're going to talk quite a bit more as we go along about why that soil carbon pool is so important. All right, so let's narrow down now from a generalized look across all forests in Massachusetts, and let's look at just the oak pine type, which is where we find pitch pine scrub oak barrens. This, if any of you folks haven't seen it, is a wonderful publication put out by a cooperative effort between UMass Amherst and the University of Vermont, and is just a tremendous resource. And they looked at 4 different major forest cover types. So I just grabbing the example they had for an oak pine type. And this shows an oak pine stand in the Northeast that's 80-ish, 90-ish years old, like much of our forest is. That an oak pine forest, full canopied forest, is going to support about 82 metric tons of carbon per acre. That's how much is stored there. Now, I want to point out a couple of things. One is that the largest portion of the carbon storage occurs in the dark green area, which is the live above ground biomass, as we mentioned before. About 39% of total system carbon, if you will, is in the live above ground pine and oak trees. But notice again that the soil organic pool is right behind in the lighter green, 33%. All right. And that has really big implications when it gets to carbon trade-offs in the pitch pine scrub oak barrens. Now, as you saw in some of the pictures earlier, pitch pine scrub oak barrens, are a very open canopied forest. It's the shrub layer that really dominates. So they're not going to support 82 metric tons per acre. But based on the literature I've been able to find, we're estimated that an intact restored barren system is still somewhere in the vicinity of 25 to 30 metric tons per acre. Now, please keep that figure of 25 to 30 tons per acre in mind. And now we're going to look at a little bit of, I think, pertinent research regarding fire management and carbon budgeting in Pine Barrens systems. And there's a lot of concern today in terms of mitigating climate change. People don't like the idea of cutting trees, of using prescribed fire, because it releases carbon. And that is undeniably true. What we need to focus on is the amount of release, what happens to that carbon, and what happens to the site afterwards. Now, this paper did a good job of actually quantifying carbon release, and as you can see, it averaged out to be about 1.9 metric tons of carbon per acre. Now, that's, again, nothing to ignore, but 1.9 metric tons per acre released through a prescribed burn out of a total of 25 to 30 metric tons per acre. It's not like the bulk of the carbon in the system is being released, and that's an important point to make. Okay. Another thing is that the carbon that is released during a burn, that 1.9 tons per acre, is completely recovered, resequestered within just 2 to 3 years, because the response of the scrub oak and the high bush and low bush blueberry and other native shrubs is so strong once the sun is put on them. And not only do you have that recovery completed within 2 to 3 years, but you're only burning once every 5 to 8 years. So you've got, after full recovery, 3 to 5 additional years of carbon sequestration and storage. And a lot of this happens in that soil carbon pool because of the robust root systems associated with scrub oak. I want to take a look at one graphic out of that paper. It's a little bit complicated, but it's just going to show net CO2 exchange over time. So going left to right across the bottom of the screen is time, and the annual fluxes are carbon within a pitch pine scrub oak barrens system. So here you can see that 2 to 3 year recovery period from the end of one fire sequence to the beginning of another. And then you can look at the additional 3 to 4 years of increased carbon storage before the next burn takes place, all right, here toward the right-hand side of the graph. And the most important thing I want you to notice is that as you move from one prescribed burn period to the next, you are starting at the beginning of the next burn period at a substantially increased carbon level in the whole system. So you are increasing carbon storage over time while you're restoring the Barrens system. That's a really important point for people to understand. So we were at this, we saw this slide before. The conclusion that this paper reached, I think, is pretty important, in that over time, a regime of prescribed fire to restore and maintain, globally imperiled pine barrens systems does not really contribute to have any appreciable effect on a long-term carbon release. Okay, it's to restore pine barrens does not mean that we are contributing to climate change. Another article to take a quick look at here really gets into the use of prescribed fire as a practice. Again, we're all concerned with carbon release, carbon storage these days. But what it turns out that prescribed burning actually works as a real stimulus, because it's a low intensity fire to increase and stabilize soil organic matter, the carbon in soil organic matter. So when you're talking about restoration of pitch pine scrub oak barrens, it's all about the incredibly robust root system that we don't see. It's all underground, primarily scrub oak roots, high bush, low bush blueberry, other native shrubs. The capacity for soil carbon storage in pitch pine scrub oak barrens is like unparalleled compared to other forest types. And so prescribed burning can actually be used to stabilize and enhance the carbon storage in soil organic matter. And that's a pretty important point. All right, back to Miles Standish, because I don't want to overstate, Massachusetts is not California, okay? But we do have lightning caused fires in drought years. The DCR, Bureau of Forest Fire Control, responded to more than a dozen lightning caused fires across the state last year during the last drought period, all right? And in the absence of prescribed fire, this is what happens at a place like the Miles Standish complex. Here, this picture was taken in 1957. Fire had been excluded from this site for pushing 100 years. And the point I want to make is that these are fire adapted systems, and it's not a question of if they will burn, but when and So you can have these catastrophic periodic burns, which you see all the time in California these days, but don't kid yourself. They have happened here in Massachusetts, and a prescribed fire program can really do a lot to prevent these. So back to this other paper on fire effects that really pointed out the capacity of the root system in the pitch pine scrub oak barrens. Their conclusion here at the bottom of the screen that prescribed fire is a legitimate tool to promote, soil organic matter stability, okay, and can really has the potential to be an important, nature-based solution to increasing carbon storage. So we really can have our cake and eat it too. Okay, so what happens in a pine barrens if you exclude fire is that white pine tends to take over completely and dominate the site. These maps show the range areas of pitch pine, which is the lower map, white pine, the upper map, and you can see that white pine completely overlaps pitch pine. I've got nothing against white pine, but there's only so many places where we can have pitch pine scrub oak barrens. All right. Now, a couple of important points that really get to the carbon trade-off issue. White pine is a generalist species that will basically grow anywhere. However, it competes best. It's the most aggressive competitor on these dry, sandy soils that you find in barrens systems. Okay, that's why when you exclude fire from a barren system, white pine says, thank you very much, moves right in, and over the next, 40, 50 years begins to dominate it and form a closed canopy forest. All right, but an important point is that these are not the kind of soils where white pine grows best. It has its highest growth rate in sandy loams associated with riparian, stream and river areas. Another important thing that comes in with these carbon trade-offs is that white pine can achieve maximum growth in less than 50% full sunlight. That's pretty unusual, and you can have a lot of white pine trees on an acre, and they can all be a full canopy forest of white pine, and they can all be growing at rapid rates. And a question I like to pose and have you think about for a minute is, how long does white pine continue to grow really rapidly and store massive amounts of carbon? So think about that for a minute. We'll come back to it. But to help answer that question, let's go back to that excellent forest carbon booklet by Paul Catanzaro and Tony D'Amato. And they make two major points. One is that total carbon storage is greatest in old growth forest, okay, which is the outer dark brown circle. However, an important point in terms of climate change mitigation is, yes, we want carbon that is stored, we want to keep it stored, but we also want to take carbon out of the atmosphere. And the sequestration rate is greatest in much younger forests. And this is an important point. 30 to 70-year-old forests are where you are getting the most carbon per year, per acre per year extracted from the atmosphere. Okay, so back to this previous slide, and it's a period of about 200 years that white pine can really grow rapidly. So if you think about white pine in a fire excluded barrens coming in, dominating, forming a full canopy forest, that forest can sequester carbon rapidly, not just till up to around 70 years of age, but potentially up to around 200 years of age. So there honestly are. That's a carbon trade-off, I would say. All right, and we have to admit, those of us like myself that are adamantly in favor of storing pine barrens, we have to admit that there is a potential to store an immense amount of carbon and barrens sites if you exclude fire and allow the white pine to dominate. Okay, we're getting towards the end, and I want to talk about the site index or growth capacity of white pine on different areas. For those of you who are not familiar with site index charts, it's not as complicated as it might look. This chart is showing the range of total height growth for white pine across different soil types. Those are the different curved lines you see going from lower left to upper right. The single vertical line is its base age 50. In other words, we're saying at 50 years, if white pine is free to grow, how tall does it get on a given site? We said earlier, it grows anywhere, even on the worst sites. The bottom curve says you're going to get about 60 feet of height growth of white pine in 50 years. On the best sites, it's twice that. And this is where pine barrens fit in, those highly excessively well-drained soils. This is where white pine competes the best. So if you exclude fire, you're about site index 80 for white pine, meaning a height growth of 80 feet in 50 years. Now, white pine grows most rapidly in these riparian sandy loams, but it's harder for it to compete there. So my point is that we can grow white pine pretty much anywhere. And I don't think we should be growing it on some of the few remaining barrens sites that we have. I love this picture, which was taken before I was born. This is an old growth white pine in one of these riparian sandy loam situations along the Androscoggin River in New Hampshire. This tree was some 200 feet tall. It's not photoshopped to the best of my knowledge, but it shows you that white pine is capable of storing an awful lot of carbon. All right. So we'll close by talking about this debate, this trade-off, pull and tug about conserving biodiversity, mitigating climate change. In terms of barrens restoration, I really think we can do both. As we talked about, the soil carbon pool potential for storage in an intact pitch pine scrub oak barrens is astounding. Okay, but we have to say that if you exclude fire from those sites and allow white pine to dominate, you will store even more carbon. Now, I come down on answering this question on we really have to consider the range of ecosystem services that our forests provide. And it isn't just carbon storage and climate change mitigation. That's certainly one of the most important ecosystem services. But we can conserve biological diversity in globally imperiled barrens systems and contribute to climate change mitigation by enhancing the soil carbon pool, especially. So I will leave you with that. And Caitlin and I want to thank all the folks who are pictured here who helped out and contributed to this presentation. And with that, Will, I'll turn things back to you and stop sharing my screen.